I don't know. I don't know that I have a story like, yeah. Please.
Absolutely. Yeah, we need some people in the front row. Most people aren't that brave.
Yeah, Randy said, I'm here for your presentation. I said, I don't know that it's so much a presentation. But yes. But I am sitting in front of the room.
Yeah, you're right, 25 minutes.
So we don't have anybody that is doing this online yet, so we can go ahead and get going.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, okay.
Okay. Okay, since nobody's online. Okay, here's your quiz. I want to see you show of hands.
Do we need to introduce ourselves or before you start your quiz?
I'm Jim Wolf.
I'm Lori DeLue, and the time period we were talking about, I was the senior warden.
And I'm Mary Mead, and I was interim after John left.
Yes.
What year did you come? Aaron?
I have no idea.
Okay.
But you were here before then, because we knew.
Oh, yes, I attended here, but
Yeah.
I was
When was the
different sides.
live weekend held at Good Shepherd? Who thinks they know?
Faith a lot. I have no idea.
If you know, you're wrong.
And then,
How did the idea of an alpha course develop at Good Shepherd? What's in the write-up is wrong. What was the maximum average Sunday attendance at Good Shepherd? What was the maximum average attendance at Good Shepherd and in what year? What spiritual event solidified the spiritual life of the Good Shepherd men's group? How many things went wrong in 2003 and 2004? There's handouts in the back. And you can get them on your way out, or you can get them now. You just as good to wait till you go out because there's a lot of reading there. One of them is we had a 40th anniversary in 2016, and the write-up back there covers the church from the time it started up to 2016. And it breaks it out in the same as what we're doing. We're doing each rector. So we've had 4 rectors. Today we'll do our second rector, which is John Johansson. There's a handout out there because I had to convince our third rector that there really were some years where we had big attendance at Good Shepherd. So it goes from the last year that Father Art was here through today and shows you some statistics on the church, including one is ASA, which is average Sunday attendance. And another one, we did a major fundraising. One of the books is back there just for people to look at. And then there's a handout back there that talks about the topics that you would cover if you did an alpha course. Okay. And you can stop us at any point. I'm going to start, and you can stop us and ask questions at any point. And at the very end, I'll give you all the answers to the questions, but I hope by the time we get to that point, you'll have the answers.
I'm going to say, I feel like after you just did that, everybody look to your left, look to your right. One of you will not be here after the first week of school. That's what I was thinking.
Okay, if you remember last time, our first rector had just left the church, and we were in a position coming out of a difficult time. And typically when the diocese, when you come out of a struggle like that, they like you to take some time before you get involved with trying to bring in a new rector. It's more like healing time, healing from some of the concerns that people had and so forth. So we went through a year of that when that happened. And
What year was it?
that was 1994.
Okay.
And who was your interim?
Good question. Our 2 interims were Father Dick Palmer. Dick Palmer was here, and we got a brand new transitional deacon ready to be ordained out of a very conservative college in Tulsa, Oklahoma, named Phil Eberhardt. And they worked with us And they were actually a great combination. Phil was actually here more, and he was here during the week. Dick primarily was here on Sundays, did a lot of the preaching until Phil was ordained, which was about 4 to 5 months after he came. The reason that was real interesting, and I'm pretty naive. I'm a pretty naive, straightforward guy. And it wasn't until after they both left that we realized that Father Dick Palmer was gay and Father Phil Eberhardt was the most conservative person you'll ever run into. But they made a great combination, and they did a great job. After Phil Eberhardt was ordained, Father Dick Palmer actually left, and Phil stayed on. And then after about a year, he got called to St. Gregory's. Now, it was during that time that actually Martin Owens, who some of you know was here at that time, he came up with the idea, let's do a Faith Alive weekend, which was fine. And actually the head of the team that brings in a Faith Alive weekend was Tom and Katie Branch, and they were at a church here in Denver. I knew them really, I know them today really well. Didn't know them at that time. And we did all this planning, and we thought this Faith Alive weekend would really pull the church together because of the time we were going through. And so we were planning, we had everything ready to go, and it was about a week before the Faith Alive weekend, and I get a call. And it turns out it's Tom Riley, who is the president of Faith Alive. And he said, who's your rector? And I said, well, we're going through an interim time, and Phil Eberhardt is here as our rector right now. And he said, well, you realize you can't have a Faith Live weekend unless you have a rector in place. And I said, Tom, we've planned this for 4 or 5 months. The people that are here are excited about it. You're going to pull the rug out from under us at this point. And silence. Finally, I hear Tom say, the only way I will let you do this Faith Alive weekend is if I come and I am the lead person. And I said, Tom, come on. And so we got the president of Faith Alive, and he came in and he did the weekend. And I will tell you, at that time, because of the transition from Father Art, we really needed something to really pull the people that were here together. And the Faith Alive weekend really did that. It was a big help in holding the church together during that period of time, as we were transitioning into calling a new rector. After Phil Eberhardt got called to a church, and the diocese appointed Father Ted Boswell to be our interim. In that period of time, it was the second year. It was during that period of time that we actually formed a calling committee, and it was the search committee was headed up by Art Moore, who I think a lot of you knew Art and Diane Moore, and they started working on the process of calling a new rector. And Ted was here. He was here for almost a year, and I became really close to Ted. And one day I walked into Ted's office and I said, how are things going? And Ted said, they're really going well. In fact, they're going so well that I think I'm going to put my name in to be called as a rector, which was sort of a no-no. If you were an interim, you weren't supposed to put your name in. And he said, well, what do you think about that? And I said, without thinking, you know, the words that go out and then you wish you could grab them and bring them back. I said, Ted, I think you're too liberal for this church. And I thought he was going to come across the desk and wring my neck, because he stood up and he started saying, you don't understand conservative or liberal. You have no idea what you're talking about. And I just looked at him. I said, I didn't say anything. I was just thinking, Ted, you just confirmed my thoughts. And that was one of my more interesting experiences with Ted, The other one is that we had a visit from the bishop during the time that Ted was here. And usually, if you probably don't know this, but usually the administrator for the bishop calls about a week ahead of time before the bishop comes and say, are there any questions that are going to be thrown at me and so forth. I honestly do not remember what the question was, but there were 3 women at the reception following the service that went after the bishop on issues, and it may have had to do with the gay issue and so forth. And the bishop was completely unprepared for that. And the next day I saw Ted, and Ted said, my career is over in the Diocese of Colorado. He said the bishop was so mad at those questions that he got asked, and we failed to tell him ahead of time he was going to get those. And he was sure, poor Ted was sure that his career was over. As it turned out, Ted finally did leave, as we were calling our new rector. And he actually went down to Canyon City and was an interim down there. And then he became the rector of St. Paul's in Lakewood. And that's where he finished his career. So he did fine. He didn't get excommunicated out of the Diocese of Colorado. With that, we were moving into 96. We called Father John Johansson, Ohio native, Ohio State graduate. That'll come into play here in a little while. Had a law degree, very smart. He was called, he had gone through seminary, and he had been a priest at a church. Trying to remember, I don't know if I really put it down, but Father John had a great personality. The word I always use, and I don't know if this is a great word to use with rectors, but he was a great schmoozer. John knew how to talk to everybody, and everybody loved him. And because of that, we started growing. Nina Churchman came into the church as a transitional deacon. She was ordained here, and she became John's assistant, and we were growing. Now, we were growing for several reasons. Number one, Willow Creek was being built out, so there was a lot of new people moving in. Highlands Ranch was being built, and we were the closest church for Highlands Ranch because St. Timothy's was still downtown. And so those factors all built into it. Diane Moore, who some of you know, had left the church for a while as a deacon, came back as a deacon. In 1998, somebody asked this question at our last meeting. Bill Henwood came in as a deacon. Many of you know Bill Henwood. He was here forever. And Bob Franken was a deacon also here. Bob is now up at in Breckenridge. And so we had lots of deacons, we had John, we had an assistant, and things were going well. Pretty dramatic growth in that period of time. I mentioned Highlands Ranch. In the year 2000, we had 3 services, one at 7:30, one at 9:15, and one at 11. The 7:30, we called ourselves the Nifty 50 because we actually were pretty close to 50 people in attendance. 9:15 was our family service. And then 11 o'clock, the contemporary group actually played for that service. Nina Churchman got called to a church. I think she went to St. Mary's and St. Peter's. And Bonnie Spencer came in 1999. And a lot of you know Bonnie. But John and Bonnie combined together and they made a great combination. And we were growing fast. In 1998, we decided to do an Alpha course here. I was really good friends with Ron Wilburn, who was here in that period of time. And Ron had left the church, and I like to say we sent a missionary over to Christ Church, Denver. Ron was over there with Sandy Green, who was the priest at the time. And they went back east and locked into a bunch of programs that were being offered on the East Coast. And one of them was the Alpha program. And they really liked it. And so they brought that back to their church. And they had done a couple Alphas at Christ Church. And then they actually had a mission they started. The church was called Holy Spirit, and it was in Highlands Ranch. And they were trying to start a church in Highlands Ranch. So that was a mission of Christ Church, Denver. And they did an Alpha course. Well, Ron and I were talking, he said, this course is great. It's something that you guys ought to look at. So I called Holy Spirit and talked to Jeff Gwynn, who was there, and some of their people. And I asked him if they were going to do any more Alphas. And he said, yeah, we'd like to do another one. But our problem is they were actually in a junior high school in Highlands Ranch. And so they wanted to do another Alpha, but they didn't really have the space they could use. Well, they had the experience of doing an Alpha. We had the space. And so I talked them into doing an Alpha here where they would provide the leadership and we would provide the space. And that was the very first Alpha that we ever did. Alpha is primarily aimed at new people in the church or people that have just come over the Episcopal Church, or even a lot of people that just happen to hear about you doing Alpha and they would like to attend it, even though they're not members of your church. So we did that first Alpha. The powerful part of Alpha is a retreat weekend in which we explore 3 tapes on the Holy Spirit. We did that at Bear Trap Ranch. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's down out of Colorado Springs. It just turned out that Bonnie Spencer, when she was in college, she did a lot of work at that camp. It was an InterVarsity Christian fellowship camp, and she went there and worked every summer. So she knew the camp really well. And so John and Bonnie went. Well, the only problem we ran into the first Alpha on the retreat weekend, the Church of the Holy Spirit believed that every person should try to speak in tongues. And that's just one of the gifts that people have, and we could spend a lot of time talking about that. But I knew we were going to have a problem on the weekend because even my wife was on that one. And there was no way my wife was going to be involved with that. Well, God has a way of taking care of things. And it was sad in a way, but 2 of Jeff Gwynn's kids got sick 2 days before the retreat, and Jeff couldn't go. And so John Johansson coordinated the retreat, and he made it much more light than what Holy Spirit was used to doing. The retreats are really what is the difference between Alpha and a lot of other courses that you can take. And so we finished that one. And then we decided Bob Pomeroy, who some of you know, Bob's a lawyer and an excellent speaker in public and better speaker than I am. So he took over as the lead person, and we did a second Alpha. And at the end of the second Alpha, we both went to Father John Johansson and said, we're done. We did 2. We caught most of the new people. That was great. And John Johansson looked at us and said, you're not done. He said, you're going to do more Alphas. And I said, why? And he said, all the leaders that I'm getting to pick up new responsibilities in the church are coming out of the Alpha class. And he said, I want that class to continue. So we ended up doing 7 Alphas here. We always did them in January, February, and March because that was a quiet time in the church right before Easter. The only problem is where that camp is, Bear Trap. It's a difficult road to get into. And in that time of period, you can get some really bad snowstorms. And we had one of those. But Alpha, the last one we did, actually, our rector and a Lutheran rector over at Holy Spirit across from DeKoven Park, we became sister churches, and our rector and their rector exchanged pulpits one Sunday. John went over there and preached, their rector came over here. So the last Alpha we did, we said, well, we'd like to do it jointly with you. If many of you don't know, one of the saving graces on this whole thing was Margie Clearup and Dave Hill loved to cook for big groups. And they did virtually all our cooking, because the Alpha includes a dinner, a movie, and then a small group discussion. And the reason Alpha was so powerful was because when you're sitting and having a meal and you're having a discussion with 6 or 7 people, you can really get to know people. And if you do that over 10 to 12 weeks, you get to know these people really well and you build relationships. And the same thing was true in the small groups where you stayed with that group of 8 to 10. And that's why people came out of the course and they felt like they knew more people in the church. They had a better handle on the Episcopal Church and so forth. The last Alpha we did with the Lutheran Church, we put it together, and Margie and her team, a couple people, 2 or 3 people were going to cook for that one. We ended up with 100 participants. And when I told Margie that, she said, this is going to be interesting. But we really, I mean, that was a very powerful time in our church.
2003.
2003, I think, was the last one we did.
And it was over there.
And it was over there. During this time, we really changed the church around a lot. We really invited AA groups, SA groups, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, yoga, community organizations, homeowners association to use our building. That's when a lot of that happened. And it made us become more of a community church for the community. And we're still doing that today. We have a lot of groups that use our church. The men's group story, I will tell you, happened in 1997, I believe. What happened is we gathered for breakfast, and we were standing around in the old kitchen up there. And Martin Owens walks in, and Martin was extremely quiet that morning, and that was not typical of Martin. Finally, I looked at Martin and I said, Martin, what's going on? And he said, I had a biopsy this week. I got the results back. I have pancreatic cancer, and they gave me 4 months to live. And you could have heard a pin drop in that kitchen for about the next 5 minutes. I mean, we were just all stunned. Art Moore and I looked at each other and we said, well, what are we going to do? And Art and I decided, well, the only thing we could do is lay hands on and pray for him and pray for healing. When you lay hands on, usually they ask the person, what do you want us to pray for? Just in case he wanted us to pray for something else. At the very end of the meeting, there were 12 of us there, which I think is an appropriate number. And we laid hands on Martin Owens. It's one of the few times in my life as I was praying for Martin, tears were running down my cheeks. And I'll remember that to the day I die. It is like it happened yesterday. And I was close with Martin, and I thought I was going to lose a friend. Martin came to me and we were talking about a week later, and he said, I'm going to Mexico. And I said, what are you going to Mexico for? And he said, I've heard there is a drug down there that is not in use in the United States, but it is in use in Mexico, and I want to try it. And so I said, okay. And he said, we've got some really good friends in San Antonio. We're going to stop on the way down there and visit with them, and then we're going to continue on to Mexico. And Martin went down there, and he stopped in San Antonio, and it turned out the people he were visiting had gotten a call, and they had heard that about Martin coming down there. And the foremost doctor for pancreatic cancer was in San Antonio. And he asked these people if he could talk to Martin when he came down there. So Martin said, sure, I'll talk to him. Well, the guy said, we would like to take a sample of the mass that is around your pancreas, because it'll help us with our evaluation and the work we're doing with pancreatic cancer. I'm hoping I don't lose it here. Anyways, they took the sample, and 2 days later, they called back and they said, the mass is there, we got the sample, but your mass is benign. And so Martin came back and he had an operation and they removed the mass. And we don't know what happened. We don't understand what happened that morning. All I can tell you now that people have talked, and Martin even talked, he said, when you were praying for me, I felt something inside of me that was really hot and warm. And he said, I can't explain it. But he was completely healed. And that's only part of the story for me personally. 2 years later, he asked me to go on a Faith Alive weekend at a church in Lamar. And I reluctantly said yes. And on a Faith Alive weekend, I was a rookie. And being a rookie, I was just kind of watching what everybody else was doing. And we asked for people that would like to have prayers on Sunday to come forward. Now, in reality, it's an altar call, but we just asked for people that would like to have prayers. And a bunch of people came up, and I was a rookie, so I was sitting in the pew and I thought, okay, I'm going to pray for the rest of the team as they pray for these people. So I kneeled down and I was praying. The next thing I knew, I felt a tap on my shoulder. And I looked up and it was Martin. And Martin said, are you part of this team? And I said, well, yeah. He said, well, you need to get up on the altar and pray for people. I said, okay. And I went up there and there was a young man who had been in Iraq, the war in Iraq. And he had been exposed to Agent Orange. And one of the people were praying for him. I laid my hands on him and just all I did was lay my hands on him. And I finished the prayer and I'm thinking to myself, well, that was pretty easy. Yeah. So I turned around and I started to walk off the altar. And as I got to the entrance to the altar, because they had an altar rail there, a man stopped me and I said, yes. And I said, and I knew his name. And I said, what would you like? And he said, I'd like you to pray for me. And all I can remember is I closed my eyes and I said, God, you got me into this. You better give me the words. And I laid hands on him and I prayed for him. And I kept my eyes closed as I was doing that. And then I opened my eyes and there were 6 or 7 people lined up behind him. And I'm going, God, you got me into this. And fortunately, we scattered the people among the team. But that was the beginning of me doing 30 Faith Lives around the country, of which I led 4 of them. And that was, for me, the really healing part of Martin being healed, because that allowed me to do something that I never thought I would do. I'm not that type of person, but I because of Faith Alive and Alpha, I've really changed my whole thought process and how I work with a lot of those things. I'll finish up. I think we're going to go pretty fast through this, just so you know, and people reminded me this. In 2001, 2002, we did pay off the mortgage because it wasn't that much. And so we did pay off the mortgage. The growth was phenomenal. In 2002 and 2003, I think you've heard this, we've had over an average Sunday attendance of 400. on a Sunday, which is unbelievable because of the parking around here. But we park cars every place, down the street, at that entryway, we had cars lined up on both sides. I've heard people say in 2001, we were one of the fastest growing Episcopal churches in the United States. I don't know whether it was 3, 4, or 8, but we were a fast growing church. Father, go ahead.
Episcopal Church.
Episcopal
Yes.
Church, right. Fastest growing Episcopal church in the United States. We were in the top 3 or 4. Father John became the canon missioner for the High Plains region. His administrator was Nancy McClung, who went to church here, who is now the assistant to the bishop. In 2002, our average Sunday school attendance was over 100. And we were rocking and rolling. We actually formed a large steering committee, and we looked at 3 options: do nothing, sell this building and move to a new location where we could have more parking, or 3, remodel. The final decision was made to remodel. We brought in a firm called RSI out of Dallas to do the fundraising, and we raised $950,000. Architects designed the expansion. You're sitting in a big part of that expansion, and the estimated cost was $1.25 million. And I always remember John and I talking, and he said, Jim, don't worry about it. We got $950,000 in 3 years. When that's all paid up, we'll do a second fundraiser. We'll raise the $300,000. We will pay it off, and everything will work out great. Okay, the last question on the list. What went wrong? In 2003, if you remember, there was a general convention. You probably don't remember that, but there was a big general convention, and the major issue was the approval of a gay bishop from New Hampshire, Eugene Robinson. We had 2 of the 8 delegates from the state of Colorado. They were Father John Johansson and Larry Hitt. I think a good part of this church felt like they would probably vote no. They ended up both voting yes. And the reasoning was pretty sound. I mean, the reason was if the state of New Hampshire wants this person as their bishop, why should we stand in the way of that happening? And it was a very prayerful general convention. And so they came back. We had a meeting at the church with, I don't know if any of you were in that meeting. Whitney was, I was. There was probably 40 or 50 families that came to that. After they explained their vote and so forth, about 20 of those families left the church because they were very conservative and they could not accept the vote of our rector for Eugene Robinson. The next thing that happened is John Kerner, who many of you know, took over the construction as a representative of the church. And just as we started the construction, John, we were several months into it, and he and Mary Jane took a trip to the Philippines, and they came back, and he was infected with something in the Philippines. He got sick and he passed away. The bad thing about that is he had about 50% of what was going on with the construction in his head instead of having it written any place. And so suddenly the key person from Good Shepherd's standpoint who was involved with the remodeling construction passed away. And Larry Hitt actually was senior warden at that time, and he took it over. And I know, Larry, you're going to be listening with Shelley, and you'll listen to this tomorrow. So Larry was supposed to be here with me. Unfortunately, he had a family issue up in Fort Collins, and so he's not here. At the same time, John Johansson suddenly decided he was going to accept a call to a new church in Columbus, Ohio. And so John left. And the 950,000 that we had raised with the 20 families that left suddenly became 750,000. The construction, we were the first permit that ever went through the city of Centennial after it was formed. And so they went over that whole permit in detail. If you go and look at our parking lot, it's slanted down towards the front door, if you've never noticed that. They were very concerned about the water runoff coming down and coming into our church and perhaps causing a flood. And so they wanted something installed such that it would take care of that. So we had to take out our whole parking lot and we installed a system underneath that parking lot for water. And I don't know what Whitney thinks about that, but to the best of my knowledge, I'm not sure it ever worked. Yeah. But suddenly our 1.25 million became 1.5 million. And John had left, families had left. And so we were 750,000 short of what we needed to pay off the new debt. And if you will remember, in that period of time, we were just headed into a recession in the early 2006, 7, and 8. And nobody wanted to take on a fundraising or a capital campaign. And so at that point, John had left.
Well, I don't have quite the same stories that Jim does, but I will tell you, Mary and I became very close over that next year. Bonnie called, I think it was sometime in November or December of 2003, and asked if I would be the senior warden. And I said, isn't that what a grown-up does? And she said, well, Lori, I think you can handle it, but let's talk about it. And so I called my father, who had been senior warden, and I'm a cradle Episcopalian. And so my father had been senior warden at our church and junior warden and treasurer and all kinds of things. I think he's still, I don't know that he holds an office today, but I think he's still on vestry. And so my dad and I talked about it, and I said, well, I guess I can do this. I was single. I had a good job, and I was living in Parker at the time. And so I said, okay, Bonnie, let's meet and let's talk. And so we were talking about it. And then she said to me that she was in love and in a relationship. And I said, wonderful. And I kind of had an idea in the back of my head, and she told me who it was, and I started to cry and was really, really happy for her. And the woman that she is now married to, I think they're married. Are they married?
Yes, they're married.
Was the wife of a former Episcopal priest and was a parishioner here. And so I said, who else knows what else has gone on? And she said, well, I'm sort of slowly telling people one at a time. And so she said, she was overjoyed at my reaction. And so I think that gave her the confidence to say, will you be the senior warden for Mary and me as we go through this interim period? And so I said, yeah, if you can manage whatever's going to come because of all of this, then I'll be here with you. So I think Jim was spot on about Alpha, because I came 1999 in September, I came to church and it was crowded. And I don't remember which service, but I had moved out here to date this guy that I had met back in Pennsylvania. And he was moving to Colorado, and I wasn't getting any younger. I was 33 at the time. And I said, okay, well, let's see how this relationship goes. And I came out to visit him in the December before. I thought Denver was pretty awesome. And so I moved here. And he found Good Shepherd and said, there's an Episcopal church, maybe you'll go there. And I came in September of 1999. He and I broke up. He moved back to Texas. It was all good. Anyway, and so I came that Sunday, whatever day that was, and I never stopped. And so it was just wonderful. And the parish just continued to grow, and it was full of people. We did Alpha, I think, that January. I don't know if it was the first or the second one, but in 2000. And I met so many wonderful people. And you were right about leaders coming out of that organization and that group. And a lot of those families were families that then left that I had met, but still a lot of people remained. And it was just really I felt like it was a really wonderful time in the church. And then John left, John Johansson left, and John Kerner actually became sort of a mentor to me in my senior warden role. And so not only did he leave with half of the knowledge, but he also left a huge hole in this parish. And
we might say one thing.
Yeah.
At that period of time is when John left, Mary was appointed as the interim. So you had Mary as the interim, and you had Lori as the senior warden.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're the team, and
I'd like
the
to
three
say-
women.
Yeah, which was also another shock for the church, I think. But I had spoken with Bonnie before I accepted the interim position, and I knew what was going to happen, that she was going to come out. But the deal was that she was working on an assignment that would have taken her to Fort Collins. And she would have been here about maybe 2 months, and then would have left to become rector of the church in Fort Collins. And so there was going to be, ground tremors here, but not earthquakes.
And we had a new bishop.
And we had a brand new bishop who was out of touch because he was getting trained to be a bishop. What happened was that the bishop came on board, and there was a whole turmoil in the diocese. Lots of churches were threatening to leave. And his way of approaching that, his job was to keep the church together. And so he decided that there would be no changes for his first year. He would try to hold as many people in communion as he could. And then as the decisions were made by the national church and also locally about how to move forward with the gay and lesbian issue, then in a year he would begin to act on those decisions. But he was trying to give everyone the longest possible chance to say yes to the Episcopal Church in its new stance. The problem with that was that Bonnie was here, and she was going gradually house to house, people she knew, trying to announce who she was, and do that privately, and really hadn't come out publicly. And one of the people that heard the news through actually her spouse, not herself, decided that if she did become rector in the church in Fort Collins, that would be to do something different. And that would break the bishop's promise. And no one saw it that way until he pointed that out to the bishop. And so the bishop came to her, they went together to Fort Collins, and the bishop announced that she could not be rector of that church, which was a huge shock to her and to me, but not because I was worried about this church, but because it was so painful. And so she was here to ride out the storm of her coming out, rather than to do it at a distance in a church that knew that and would accept her. I was being advised by the canons and people that were reachable not to have any kind of open discussion about this, because people would say things that would permanently mar in the memory of the church their relationship with each other. And so we were simply acting. And it needed, we found out through, because we were, as interim, the crew was, working on the process of calling a new rector. And in that, they found out that the majority of the church that was here, the vast majority, I think 87%, said that if the ruling on gays and lesbians came out in favor of gays and lesbians in all portions, that they would not leave. And another few percent, 3 or 4%, said they'd have to think about it. And that left a 5% that definitely was going. And so, so I had to do something to settle the issue so it wasn't going to be constantly talked about. The only thing that I could think to do without talking about it was to allow Bonnie to use the completely torn up under construction sanctuary to make vows between herself and her spouse. It was not a marriage. It was not consecrated. I was not there. But it was their way of uniting and becoming a couple. And that, was explosive. But it did settle the issue as to where the rector was standing in all of this, and more or less divided the waters. Those who'd left were going to leave, and those who were going to try to weather the storm were there. And so we passed the crisis, if you will, at that point, and just came through. Meanwhile, the church.
We were having vestry meetings in an apartment over here.
Yeah.
And the vestry was very emotional because these people were confused, people were upset, people were sad, people were happy. It was a very interesting time on vestry. Pete, I don't remember. You weren't on vestry.
No, I wasn't on
I think one of the Sellen friends was on vestry. I know Doris Trulor was on vestry. Keith Anderson, God love Keith. He and I became best friends that year. He was the junior warden, but we worked through it. And
we had a meeting.
It was incredible
with the bishop.
We did have a meeting with the bishop. And as it turns out, so my cousin Mark, because we didn't have a rector in April of 2005, which is when my now husband and I, when we got married, who I started dating in the middle of all of this. John and I got married on April 2nd, 2005. And my cousin Mark, who is a priest back east, he came and married us. And I called the bishop, and I knew the bishop and Mark, their relationship. The Bishop O'Neill, had been Mark's senior rector in Massachusetts. So I called him and I said, I'm getting married and I've asked Mark to come marry me. And Bonnie told me that I need to ask your permission for that. And he said, well, yeah, I just need it in writing. So there's a lot of rules. We have a lot of rules, as you haven't already figured out. And so he wrote a letter to the bishop, and of course he said yes. But we had a meeting with the bishop, and my first meeting with him was that meeting. And he didn't know me, and I turned to him and I said, Mark Wassler is my cousin. And it was great. So he and I had a great relationship. Through all of this, I talked to him on the phone several times, in the car, waiting at the doctor's office, different places. Just whenever he could talk, he would, and I could get a hold of him, and he and I would talk through all of this. And we were very prayerful. The vestry was very prayerful together. Everybody stayed on the vestry. Nobody left, even though there was a lot of confusion and a lot of people's internal, I don't know, is it their morals or whatever they were struggling with? Some people were really challenged, but openly talked about it with the vestry. It was a really incredible time. And we lost John Kerner in the middle of all of that. We cried through vestry meetings. It was a worst of times and the best of times. Yes. Are we out of time?
No, but I think the most damaging thing that happened during that period of time was one of the rectors outside of our church gave his interpretation on everything that was going on at Good Shepherd to the religious
Rocky
writer for the
Mountain News.
Rocky Mountain News.
Yeah.
And so because Bonnie made the decision to individually tell people, and the vestry knew about it, but most of the church didn't know what was going on. And unfortunately, they read it in the paper, and they read the interpretation of somebody that really glamorized the whole thing. It made it sound like the whole church was supporting this and the whole church knew about what was going on and so forth. And that made it a difficult time also. Whitney?
Mary, are you comfortable talking about go back that you first? Because of that decision.
Yeah, because of the decision to use the sanctuary. My decision about using the sanctuary was an issue. The bishop did not approve of that use of the sanctuary. He thought it was
Inappropriate.
revolutionary. And he came and met with the vestry to make his opinion clear. And that, you know, we shouldn't be doing that. For me, personally, it was important that this church not remember having at any point treated Bonnie badly. Where the church was heading was already a done deal. We hadn't done it in convention, but
Right.
this was where we were going. People who couldn't do it with us, that was very sad, but the best thing was to stick together and stay on the what I thought was the righteous path. And so if Bonnie was able to baptize at that altar and preach at that altar and consecrate at that altar, I could not in my heart find a way to say she couldn't say her vows to one another in front of that altar. And that would have been the thing that would have been a tearing of the good spirit of this church. And that's why I did it. Also, it solved the issue of which side I was on. But so I did it. It was one of the better moves I've ever made, in my opinion.
It was a surprise to me. I didn't know it had happened.
Yeah.
Right. It wasn't
Until
a big
after it
deal.
happened, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't a big deal.
And the
Except
sanctuary
that-
was all torn up because we
No,
were
it
under
was a
construction.
mess. It was just the place that was, you know, so. The bishop took me to task for that. I was kind of surprised he didn't fire me. But I think he was more worried about what would continue here.
And what Whitney may be alluding to, I think he suspended Bonnie for what, 6 weeks or something. It was a short period of time.
Yeah, she was, yeah.
But the bottom line is, you're still here.
I-
The deal's not.
Yeah. Sue, did you get your question answered? Did you have a question, Sue? No, okay.
I will always remember Case in that meeting. Case listened to the bishop very patiently through that whole thing. And at the end, he said, so there's actually no place where Bonnie and her spouse could unite.
No
Where they could
space.
unite.
No space where Bonnie and her spouse could become united as a couple.
I was talking.
And he just, thank you, Case. I'm not gonna say a word.
I talked earlier about getting words out and you wish you could get them back. One day Bonnie and I are talking here and I'm looking at Bonnie and she's talking about, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. And I said, well, I guess you're going to have to just move to a blue state. And I'm going, why did I say that?
Which she did.
Which she did. She moved to Massachusetts.
Probably one of the best things too,
Yeah.
for her
Yeah.
relationship. They were so supported in Massachusetts. And they, so supported. It was wonderful. And I also, it dawned on me, the other thing I had to ask the bishop permission for was, she came back and did the sermon at my wedding.
Mm.
And it was the best sermon ever. She compared baseball to marriage. And we had friends that hadn't been to church in ages who said that was the best sermon I've ever heard. If I knew church would be like this, I would come every Sunday. Yeah.
Just so you know, the end of that story a little bit is about 3 or 4 years later, Bonnie came back to this diocese and went back to the
very
church
same
where
church,
she had
and became a
been,
rector.
St. Paul's in Fort Collins, and she became their rector. And it, you know, we can all look back now, as I said earlier, we kind of laugh a little bit about it, but at the time.
There were things with that construction that would have also shaped, you know, they discovered a pillar in the main hall that was not able to support the roof. There's no explanation for why the roof didn't collapse,
Yeah.
other than God took pity on us.
And the story I told.
a flood in the basement too. I
We
mean, I
had
know.
flood in the basement. We dig the famous tunnel that is down there that we store things in. And when they were digging that tunnel, they found that big rock that's sitting out here. And of course, we call this the Rock of Peter, as the rock of the church, Rock of Peter. But they actually, as they were digging the tunnel down there, see, the whole plan was another big part of the church would be built out there in the grass area. The tunnel was built to go over to that new building. We were going to put an elevator in that building, and then our basement would be handicapped accessible. I'll be honest with you, I don't think that building will ever happen because it's probably a 3-level building, a $2 million expansion. I don't think that's going to happen here.
Yeah, I think what we should do is build a parking lot, but
But we did have to expand the parking lot
Yeah.
because
we
we had
did.
so many people.
there was just, you know, so if Bonnie hadn't been there, we'd still be disrupted. Just as it was really
Yeah.
quite the interesting interim.
Prayerful time.
But it
It was
was
very
people
prayerful. People
didn't
came
do
together.
anything.
Yeah,
without-
it was a very
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah.
time. And that gets us through the Bonnie time, and the committee has now been formed to call the next bishop, and that'll be the next story.
Right.
Okay,
Director.
now,
Right.
there's nobody online. One was the first. Oh,
Hey, Andy, Andy have some memories of this too. Andy was on vestry, I think, at the
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Live, it was in Ireland left, so it was probably 1995. When did the idea of the outscores, we talked about that, you heard about that. Maximum, when you leave here, if you grab, there's statistics back there, I think it's 2000, I don't remember if it's 2001 or 2002. But 2 years from there, we actually averaged on a Sunday here, over 400 people, which is pretty remarkable. Before the pandemic, we were at about 180, just to give you a reference. Spiritual event solidified the period, that was Margaret Mullins healing. And then what went wrong, I don't know that necessarily things went wrong, but a lot of things happened in that time.
Yeah, I got engaged and got married at the tender age of 39. It was a great year, but
It
it was also quite challenging.
Like I said, we laugh about it today. We weren't laughing at the time. Yeah. Questions? Anything other questions you have? It was.
Wouldn't have gone through that. It couldn't be gone.
I agree.
That's probably right. Yeah. Well,
And we could say to the incoming rector, even though convention is going to seal all of this and
Yeah.
make it permanent, this church isn't going to cause you any trouble during that. Because
Yeah.
we already settled it.
well, I don't know how many people have said to me, you got attendance 180, you don't have a parking lot that's nearly big enough. Well, what people don't remember is we had 400 here on a Sunday and we all found a place to park.
Well, you have 3
Yeah.
different services.
Yeah, we had 3 services, right?
That made it different.
Yeah.
Okay, are we done?
I think we are. It is 10:14. We got a minute left. Any questions?
Doing a great job.
And Marta was the church administrator at the time,
Right.
Marta Ives,
You ought
who
to have,
probably most of you know. She was, and she had seen us through a lot of that change, and was incredible
Right.
through all of that, sort of a rock for everybody. I think.
She was hired by Ted Boswell and she went through that whole period of time. And when you read, if you grab a copy of that and you read that period of time, I think Marta actually wrote most of that because she knew the detail of what was going on as the administrator or secretary. So it was a fun time. I've had a couple people, when I did the first one, I didn't realize people could go on and get this played back and listen to it. But I got 2 or 3 notes that said, we really enjoyed listening to your presentation for Father Art. And I'm assuming we'll have a few people that will go in and listen to this one also.
Well, the thinking is that when all 4 of these are done, is that when somebody goes to the website and clicks who are we, there will be a link to these video audio history that will always be there, sitting there as YouTube bottom. So
Oh, geez.
Now, do you want to take it back what you said?
Just something else fun that happened in that time. Our RSI consultant was none other than Jeb Stewart Magruder,
Right.
who, as some of you may remember, Watergate.
Mhm.
He and I actually became friends, and we went out to dinner a couple times. And I said, "So what was your role in the whole thing?" He said, "It was my idea." Yeah.
I'll
So
tell you
fascinating.
another
He passed away a couple
funny
years ago.
story. I was one of the people that Bonnie said, can we go to breakfast? So we go to breakfast and I think she wants to know what's going on in the men's group and so forth. And so I tell her what's going on and so forth. And I was ready to eat. And she said, okay, are you done? And I said, yes. She said, well, I want to tell you my story. And she tells me this whole story in detail. And what many of you don't know, I attended St. Timothy's. When I attended St. Timothy's, the senior warden was Jerry Anderson. And his wife is who we're talking about here, Catherine Anderson, who is the partner for Bonnie. But anyways, at the end of the conversation, she looks at me and she says, do you play poker? And I said, well, I played cards. Why do you ask me if I play poker? And and she said, I've watched your face as I've told you my whole story, and your face has not changed one time. I looked at Bonnie and I said, Bonnie, if you could see what's going on inside of me. Yeah. But those were interesting times.
Yeah, very purple. I think in the end, it was we came together.
Yeah.
As a parish and we managed through it. We came out on the other
we'd
end.
all walk through the fire and there we were on the other side. It was okay.
Thank you all.
All right.